Now, let's also try to see if this works on our forking tests, right? So this will work perfectly on our local Anvil, but will it work on our forked tests? What do you think? Pause the video and write down if you think if we run forge test -- fork URL, Sepolia, RPC URL, right? What you think will happen? Do you think this will work? Well, let's find out. Custom error. We got an error right in the setup. Uh-oh. So forge test, let's just reconfirm. Forge test does indeed work, right? Sure does. Real fast. All of our tests run, all 12 of them, they all pass. Okay, great. Then why is this failing? Let's type clear. Let's do -VVVV. Let's do 4 V's here. And we can see this is the error that we're getting. We're getting this must be sub owner when we try to add a consumer. So what's happening is in our setup of our test, we're calling deployer.run, which of course is our deploy raffle, which is calling run. And we're trying to add consumer with our subscription ID. So if we go back to our helper config, in here, we're saying, oh, we're using subscription ID 1893. So what we could do is for our test, we could do 0 and just recreate a new subscription, but we don't want to do that. We want to test with the actual subscription ID. So how do we actually do this? The reason we're running into an issue here is because of who the deployer is, who the private key is. This error that we're getting, only the person who launched the subscription can do this. Now, again, if you're doing this locally, if you're doing this on your computer and you didn't set up a subscription, we can just go ahead and set this to 0, hit clear, and this is still going to fail, but for different reasons. If you didn't create a subscription and you have this set to 0, you're going to run into this issue here where our fund subscription doesn't work. So it looks like we're running into issues all over the place. If we have a subscription, then we're running into an issue where we're not doing the sub ID. If we don't have a subscription, then we're running into an issue with balances. Let's tackle both of these. Let's change our code so that it works no matter what. All right. 2 issues here. The first one, if you do have a sub ID, and if you didn't create a sub ID, that's fine. You're going to follow along with me anyways. If you did create a sub ID, in our deploy here, we're trying to add consumer. We're calling this add consumer function, but it's failing because we're using the wrong key. When we run our test suite, we run with an Anvil default key. But when we run with a fork URL, we're running on a real fake chain. So we're going to need to pretend to be the owner of this consumer address here. Well, if we're in our test, we could just do something like a vm.prank, right? But in our deploy scripts, we can't actually prank to be somebody because in our deploy scripts, we need the actual key. So what we can do instead is when we do this start broadcast, we can actually pass in a private key and use the private key. So we can actually define what key we want to use back in our helper config. So we're going to do a little bit of refactoring here. So if we're on an actual network like Sepolia, what's our private key going to be? It's going to be our environment variable, right? So what we can do is we can get our environment variable with another cheat, vm.env-uint. And this will grab our private key from its environment variable. Again, it's going to be this key right in our .env. So since this is a hex, it's going to convert this from its hex to a number. Now, of course, since we have a deployer key, we're going to need to go up here, uint256, deployer key, like this. And since we're updating this struct, yep, we're going to have to do a whole lot of updating. So we have a deployer key for Sepolia. Down for Anvil, we're going to use the default Anvil private key. Remember, if we run Anvil, we're just going to use this as the default key. So what we can do is we can scroll up to the top here, make a constant, call address public constant default Anvil key equals, and paste it in here. Now, this is the only time I'm going to say pasting a private key in here is cool, right? Oh, excuse me. This is an address. This is a uint256. This is the hex of a uint256. Solidity is smart enough to convert the hex to an actual number. This is the only time it's cool to put a private key in plain text is when it is an Anvil private key. That is the only time it's cool to do this. Now, down in Anvil, we're going to say deployer key is going to be this default Anvil key that we created. That way, if we're on our local network, we're going to use this default key. If we're on an actual network, we're going to use a real key. And because we're using this vm.env unit, this can no longer be pure. I think it has to be a view now. Yep, it's a view now. Okay, so now we can get a deployer key. So back here, when we add consumer, we're also going to do a uint256 deployer key from our config. And when we call add consumer, we're also going to pass a deployer key in. So let's go up to add consumer and let's do uint256 deployer key. And now when we start the broadcast, we can actually just pass in the private key to use for the broadcasting. So now we're going to call add consumer with a actual deployer key, with a private key. And our setup is smart enough to know, oh, if we're on a testnet or a mainnet, we're going to use a private key from our .env. But if we're on Anvil, we're going to use this default one. So now our script is smart enough to do one or the other. Of course, since we updated our struct, we're going to have to do a whole lot of refactoring. So we got to do another comma here. We're going to have to do a whole lot of adding commas and stuff. So if we scroll up, anytime we have this in here, we're going to have to do another comma. Let's see where else. Yep, another comma here. Are we doing the helper config anywhere else? Let's look helper config. It's a little search thing here. Helper config. Yep, sure enough. In our deploy here, uint256 deployer key. And now down here in add consumer, now that we're actually getting our deployer key, we can just pass in the deployer key to add consumer. So now let's try this again. Well, let's first run forge build, make sure that I got all the refactorings. Looks like not quite. And again, remember, you can command click or control click to open this file up in the editor. Yep, sure enough, I missed one. I'm gonna do a little comma here, and this should now be good. Clear. Now let's try building again. Okay, cool. Looks like it's working now. Now again, let's try to run forge test dash fork URL, Sepolia RPC URL. And remember, this is only going to fix the issue for those of you who actually did get a subscription ID. For those of you who didn't, don't worry, this refactoring is still going to be helpful for you anyways. So dash dash fork URL, Sepolia. All right, cool. We get a different error. Dash VV. Let's see what error we got this time. We still got this must be sub owner. Remember, just to run source.env, just in case you forgot. And let's run this test again with dash v so we can see this output. And okay, great. So we get a different error here now. So now we're actually passing that last error. We're getting to a new error. So it means that adding that deployer key did fix our issue. Okay, great. So if we scroll all the way down, we can see there are two failing tests in here. One of them is this one here, and it gives a little bit of information on the versioning. So let's get this test fulfill random words can only be called after perform upkeep. So this is the one where we have the fuzzing. This one is failing. Why is this one failing? Saying call reverted as expected, but without data counterexample. So it's not giving non-existent request as its error. It's doing something else. The reason that this one's failing is let's actually look at the real VRF coordinator and not the mock contract. If we go to lib, Chainlink Brownie contracts, SRC, V08. Let's look for the VRF coordinator in here. Here it is. Let's look for fulfill random words. Okay. The real fulfill random words has an even different input. It requires a proof and a request commitment. Our mock, on the other hand, let's open up the VRF coordinator mock. Fulfill words is just the request ID in consumer. So our mock is a lot easier so that we can test it locally, but on a real network, it does something totally different. So what we can do is we can add some code in here to skip this test if we're on a fork. So I'm going to create a modifier called skip fork like this. And we're going to say if block.number, so this is going to get the chain ID, or better yet, block.chain ID. If block.chain ID does not equal to 31337, which is the Anvil chain ID, we're just going to return. Otherwise, do it. So now we can add this skip fork piece here. And now this test will only run on Anvil and not when we're doing forking. If we go down here too, we see that we end up mocking, we pretend to be the Chainlink coordinator down here. So this isn't going to work because we're not the Chainlink coordinator on a forked network. So we're also going to have to skip the fork down here. So now we have two types of tests we can run. We can just run forged test, which, as we know, are just going to pass. Or not. Let's see what I messed up here. And even this one didn't work. And because we're doing this setup though, with this deployer key, we need to make sure that the funding and the creating uses the exact same deployer key as well. So we're also going to update create subscription and fund subscription to also get a deployer key passed in. So we're going to do a little comma here, deployer key, comma here, deployer key. We're going to go to our interactions. We're going to grab the uint256 deployer key, copy this, paste it into here, add a uint256 deployer key as an input for create subscription. And now for vm.start broadcast, we're going to go ahead and make sure we're using that exact same deployer key here. And we're going to do the same thing for fund subscription. It's going to get a uint256 deployer key, vref subid link. We're going to pass this a deployer key, vref subid link. We're going to pass this a deployer key, paste it here. And then for the start broadcast, once again, we're going to do deployer key. And down here, we're also going to do deployer key. So I know we just did a huge refactoring here. All right. I know that there's a lot of work. And if you get lost, if you're like, what the heck was going on? Be sure to jump in here and follow along and check the code that we used in here. And if you're a little confused, if I didn't explain this well enough, there's definitely a lot in this section. Okay. So definitely be sure to go to the GitHub repo associated with this course, jump in discussions and ask some questions. Okay. Or use whatever AI buddy you got. All right. Because some of this can definitely be confusing. Okay, cool. So now that we've done all that, we now have two types of tests, right? I can run forged test and hopefully everything passes still. And great, everything passes still, right? I've refactored the code so that for when I'm working with forged test, which works with a Anvil chain, we work with the default key for Anvil. But will forged test -- fork URL Sepolia RPC URL work? Let's find out. We see that this one works too. And the reason that this one works is because we're skipping those two final tests here, right? In our raffle test, we're skipping test fulfill random words and we're skipping test fulfill random words, right? Anytime we need to mock or pretend to be the Chainlink VRF, we're going to skip those on the fork. Now, this is a halfway solution. This is the easy way to do this. The harder way to do this and the more intensive way to do this would be to go into your code base here, go to src, v0.6, mocks, vref coordinator, and actually, not the mocks, scroll down to the actual vref coordinator is us actually generate the proof, figure out the request commitment, and do a lot more coding here, right? We could 100% do this, and we would, in a sense, recreate a lot of the code used on the actual Chainlink node. We could 100% do that, but we're not going to do that. We're going to take this approach where we just skip it on the fork. As long as it's working locally, we're content because we're going to be doing a lot of pretending anyways. Now that we've figured all this out, we can go ahead and uncomment this as well. And let's rerun these forge test. Looks good. Forge test fork. All right. And then forge coverage. All right, awesome. We're at way higher coverage. We still have some functions that we could look over. Some of these are probably going to be the getters. We still have some branches, but we could go ahead and run that forge coverage -report and see exactly what we don't have tests for. Again, that report is going to be your insight into, have I really tested everything that I need to have tested? Is my code even ready to go on to the next step? Is my code even ready to go to audit?